You keep saying this is the last time. The last time you go back to the same kind of person. The last time you delay something important. The last time you ignore that feeling in your chest telling you something is wrong. And yet, somehow, weeks later, months later, sometimes even years later, you find yourself in the exact same situation again, just wearing a different face, different people, same outcome, different plans, same failure, different promises, same disappointment. And the worst part is not that it happens. The worst part is that a part of you already knew it would happen. You felt it early, you noticed the signs. You even had moments of clarity where you thought, I've seen this before. But you kept going anyway, so the real question is not, why did this happen? The real question is, why do you keep allowing it to happen? There is an invisible effect operating in your life right now. It doesn't scream. It doesn't force you. It doesn't look like a mistake while you're inside it. In fact, it often feels familiar, comfortable, sometimes even exciting. But it is quietly guiding your decisions in the background, shaping your patterns, pulling you toward the same outcomes again and again. And if you don't see it, you will keep repeating your life on a loop. This effect is not about intelligence. It's not about willpower. And it's definitely not about just trying harder. Some of the smartest people are trapped in the same cycles for years. Not because they don't understand what's happening, but because this operates deeper than logic. It operates at the level of identity, emotion, and memory. Let's make this real. Have you ever met someone new and felt an instant connection, like you've known them forever? Everything flows easily. The conversation is smooth. There's chemistry, familiarity, intensity. It feels right. But months later, you realize it ended exactly like your past relationships. Same emotional patterns, same frustrations, same kind of distance, same ending. At first, it feels like coincidence. Then it starts to feel like bad luck. But after a while, if you're honest, it starts to feel like something else. Like you're somehow choosing this without realizing it. Or think about your habits. You plan your week. You set goals. You feel motivated. You say, this time I'm going to be consistent. And for a few days, maybe even a week you are. You wake up earlier, you focus, you follow through, then something small happens. A little stress, a bad day, a moment of discomfort. And suddenly you fall back. Not just a little, completely. Back to the same routines you said you were done with. Back to the same distractions. Back to the same version of yourself you were trying to escape. And again, it feels confusing. Because you know better. You're not unaware. So why does awareness not translate into change? Because awareness is not the same as control. There is a deeper layer of your mind that is not interested in your goals. It is interested in what feels familiar, what feels predictable, what feels emotionally known, even if what's familiar is painful. This is where the invisible effect begins. Your brain is constantly trying to keep you in what it recognizes, not necessarily what is good for you. Familiar does not mean healthy. Familiar means known. And the brain trusts what is known more than what is good. That means if you grew up around instability, chaos can feel normal. If you were used to emotional distance, closeness can feel uncomfortable. If you learn to associate stress with productivity, rest can feel wrong. So when you start moving towards something healthier, something different, something better, your brain doesn't immediately celebrate. It hesitates. It questions. It pulls you back. Not because it wants to hurt you, but because it wants to protect you from the unknown. And this is the paradox. The same system that is supposed to protect you is also the one keeping you stuck. Let's go deeper. Every experience you go through leaves a trace, not just in memory, but in emotional expectation. Your brain starts building patterns, associations, predictions. If I do this, this is what usually happens. If I feel this, this is what comes next. Over time, these patterns become automatic. You don't consciously decide to repeat them. You fall into them. It's like walking a path in the forest. The more you walk the same path, the clearer it becomes, easier to follow. Eventually, you don't even think about it. Your body just goes there. Your decisions work the same way. You are not choosing from scratch every time. You are choosing from what has been reinforced. And that's why change feels so hard. Because you're not just changing a decision. You're trying to break a pattern that has been practiced emotionally and mentally for years. This is why people say, "I don't know why I did that again." It's not that they don't know. It's that the decision didn't feel like a decision in the moment. It felt like the natural thing to do, and that's dangerous. Because when something feels natural, you don't question it, you trust it. Even when it leads you somewhere you've already been hurt before. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. Sometimes the repetition is not just about familiarity. It's about unfinished emotional loops. There are parts of your past that didn't get resolved, emotions that didn't get processed, situations that didn't get closure. And your brain, in a very subtle way, tries to recreate similar scenarios, hoping for a different ending. It's like an unconscious attempt to fix something old through something new. So you meet someone who reminds you in some way of someone from your past, not exactly the same, but similar enough. And without realizing it, you step into the same dynamic again. This time, maybe it will work. This time, maybe it will end differently. But because the internal pattern didn't change, the outcome often doesn't either. This is not weakness. This is pattern repetition. And it happens in every area of life. Relationships, money, habits, self-image. Even the way you talk to yourself. If you constantly tell yourself you're not consistent, not disciplined, not good enough, you will unconsciously behave in ways that confirm that belief, because your brain is not trying to discover truth. It's trying to maintain consistency. Consistency between what you believe and what you experience. So if deep down you believe you always fail, success will feel like an anomaly. Uncomfortable, temporary, almost suspicious. And what happens when something feels like it doesn't belong? You push it away, not consciously, but through small behaviors, delays, doubts, distractions, until things go back to what feels normal. That's the invisible effect. It doesn't destroy your life in one big moment. It shapes your life through small, repeated patterns that feel natural but lead to the same results. And the reason it's so dangerous is because it hides behind familiarity. You don't see it as a threat. You see it as yourself. That's why people say, "That's just who I am," but most of the time, that's not who they are. That's just the pattern they've repeated long enough to believe it's their identity. And if you believe it's your identity, you stop trying to change it because now it's not a behavior. It's you. But here's the truth. Patterns can be unlearned. But only if you first recognize them as patterns, not personality, not destiny, patterns. And that requires something most people avoid. Honest observation, not judgment. Not guilt, observation, seeing your decisions clearly, seeing your repetitions. Seeing how often your new choices look suspiciously like your old ones. Because until you see it, you will keep living it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's where change begins, not in motivation, not in discipline, but in awareness sharp enough to interrupt the automatic. And that's exactly what we're going to break down next. What makes this effect so powerful is not just that it exists, but that it feels like you. That's the trap. You don't experience these patterns as something external. You don't feel like you're being controlled. It doesn't feel like a system running in the background. It feels like your preferences, your instincts, your type, your way of doing things. And because of that, you trust it, even when it has already led you to the same result multiple times. Think about how often people say, "That's just my type," but what does that actually mean? In many cases, it means this feels familiar to me. Not stable, not aligned with what they actually want long term. Just familiar. And familiarity is incredibly persuasive. It creates a false sense of certainty. A feeling that you understand what's happening even when you don't. It makes something feel right simply because it resembles something you've experienced before. This is why people can walk straight into situations that will hurt them and still feel confident in the moment. Because the brain is not asking, "Is this good for me?" It's asking, "Do I recognize this?" And recognition often wins. Let's take relationships again, because this is where the pattern becomes very visible. Imagine someone who is used to emotional inconsistency. Sometimes they receive attention, sometimes they don't, sometimes there is affection, sometimes distance. It creates a push and pull dynamic. Over time, this becomes their emotional baseline, so when they meet someone stable, consistent, available, something feels off. There is no chase, no tension, no uncertainty. And instead of feeling safe, it feels boring, flat. Something is missing, but what's missing is not excitement. It's instability. It's unpredictability. It's the emotional roller coaster their brain learned to associate with connection. So they leave the stable person and go back to someone who triggers that familiar emotional pattern. And then, months later, they say, "Why does this keep happening to me?" But it's not random, it's pattern selection. Now apply that to habits. Let's say you've spent years associating stress with escape. Whenever you feel overwhelmed, you distract yourself. Social media, food, entertainment, anything that gives immediate relief. Over time, your brain links stress with avoidance. So the moment discomfort appears, your system doesn't say, "Let's handle this." It says, "Let's escape." And it happens fast, before logic has time to step in. You don't sit there analyzing the decision. You just reach for what you've always reached for. And afterwards, you feel frustrated because you know what you should have done. But in the moment, the pattern was stronger than the intention. That's the key. Patterns are faster than conscious thought. They are automatic, efficient, energy saving. And your brain loves efficiency. It doesn't want you to think deeply about every decision. It wants shortcuts. It wants predictability. It wants familiar responses, so it builds these internal scripts. If this happens, do this. If you feel this, go there. And the more you repeat them, the stronger they become, until they start running without your permission. This is why change feels like resistance. You're not just trying to do something new, you're interrupting an automatic system. And that system doesn't like being interrupted. It pushes back. With doubt, with discomfort. With thoughts like, "This isn't me," or "This feels wrong," or "I'll just do it later." But those thoughts are not always truth. They are often the voice of the old pattern trying to survive. Let's go even deeper. There's also a neurological side to this. Your brain releases dopamine, not just when you experience pleasure, but when you anticipate something familiar that has brought reward before. That means your system is literally wired to crave the patterns you've repeated, even if they are unhealthy. If scrolling your phone has been your go-to escape, your brain starts expecting that reward the moment you feel bored or stressed. If chasing emotionally unavailable people has given you intense highs in the past, your brain remembers that. It doesn't remember the full story. It remembers the emotional spikes, and it pulls you back toward them. So you're not just dealing with thoughts. You're dealing with reinforcement, chemistry, conditioning. That's why just stop doesn't work. Because you're not fighting a simple habit. You're challenging a reinforced loop between emotion, behavior, and reward. And here's where most people make a critical mistake. They try to change the behavior without understanding the trigger. They say, "I need more discipline, I need more motivation, I need to be stronger," but strength without awareness leads to temporary change at best. Because if you don't understand what activates the pattern, you will keep getting pulled back into it. You might resist it once, twice, maybe even for a week. But eventually, something will trigger the old loop again. And if you're not prepared for that moment, you fall right back. That's why the key is not just what you do. It's what happens before you do it. The emotional state, the situation, the internal dialogue. For example, do you notice that you tend to make worse decisions when you feel lonely, or when you feel rejected, or when you feel overwhelmed? Those states matter, because they weaken your ability to choose consciously. They make the automatic stronger, and that's when the invisible effect takes over. Not when you're at your best, but when you're slightly off, a little tired, a little stressed, a little emotional. That's all it needs. And this is why people say things like, "I don't know what happened. I was doing so well." Nothing random happened. A trigger appeared. The pattern activated. And the system followed the familiar route. Again, now here's something even more subtle. Sometimes the pattern is not just about comfort or reward. It's about identity. If you've spent years seeing yourself as someone who struggles, someone who is inconsistent, someone who never finishes things, that belief becomes part of your internal structure, and your behavior starts aligning with it. Not because you want to fail, but because your brain prefers consistency over contradiction. So when you start doing well, staying consistent, making progress, something feels off. It doesn't match the identity. So you unconsciously create friction. You delay. You doubt. You lose momentum until you're back in a place that feels familiar again. That's not laziness. That's identity protection. And it's one of the strongest forces behind repeated mistakes. Because you're not just fighting habits. You're fighting the version of yourself you've accepted. And changing that requires more than effort. It requires awareness deep enough to question what you believe about yourself, not just what you do. Because if your identity stays the same, your patterns will eventually return, no matter how motivated you feel in the beginning. So when you look at your life and see repetition, don't just ask, what am I doing wrong? Ask, what is staying the same? The people, the reactions, the emotional triggers, the beliefs? Because the invisible effect is not random. It follows consistency. And if the internal structure doesn't change, the external results rarely do. Which leads to the most important part of all. How do you actually break it? Not temporarily, not for a few days, but in a way that changes the pattern itself. That's what we're going to get into next. So how do you actually break something that feels automatic? Not temporarily. Not for a few days when motivation is high, but in a way that changes the pattern itself. You don't break it by trying to overpower it. You break it by seeing it clearly enough that it loses control over you. That sounds simple, but it's not easy. Because most of your patterns operate in moments where you are not paying attention. They happen fast, quietly, almost invisibly. So the first real shift is this. You slow the moment down. Not your whole life. Just the moments that matter. The exact moments where you usually repeat the same mistake. That second where you're about to text someone you shouldn't. That moment where you're about to avoid something important. That impulse to escape, to delay, to go back to what feels familiar. That's where everything is decided. And if you let that moment pass unconsciously, the pattern wins again. So instead of trying to change everything at once, you focus on one skill, interrupting the automatic. You don't need to have the perfect decision immediately. You just need to create space between impulse and action. Because right now, for most people, there is no space. Its trigger gives reaction. Instant. No pause. No awareness, no choice. And without that pause, nothing changes. So your first job is not discipline, it's noticing. You start asking simple but uncomfortable questions in real time. What am I about to do? Why does this feel urgent? Have I been here before? And the goal is not to answer perfectly. The goal is to interrupt the flow. Because once you interrupt it, even for a few seconds, something shifts. You move from automatic to conscious, from reaction to observation. And in that space, even if it's small, you have a chance to choose differently. Now, this is where people often expect a big, dramatic change. But real change doesn't look dramatic. It looks small, quiet, almost insignificant in the moment. It's choosing not to send one message. It's choosing to sit with discomfort for 10 extra minutes instead of escaping. It's choosing to finish something even when the motivation disappears. These moments don't feel powerful. They feel uncomfortable. Sometimes even pointless, but they are not. They are the exact moments where the pattern starts to weaken. Because every time you don't follow the old path, you interrupt the reinforcement. You stop feeding the loop. And slowly, the automatic starts losing strength. At the same time, you need to understand something else. You cannot remove a pattern without replacing it. If your brain is used to escaping when stressed, you need a new response for stress. If your pattern is chasing validation, you need a new way to deal with that emotional need. If your default is avoidance, you need a new action when discomfort appears. Otherwise, you create a gap. And the brain doesn't like gaps. It goes back to what it knows. So this is not just about stopping. It's about redirecting. For example, if your pattern is checking your phone every time you feel uncomfortable, you don't just say, "Don't check." You decide in advance what you will do instead. Maybe you take a breath. Maybe you write what you're feeling. Maybe you just sit still for a moment. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be different. Because difference breaks repetition. Now let's talk about something most people avoid completely. Honesty. Not surface level honesty. Real honesty. The kind where you stop protecting your own behavior with excuses. Because patterns survive through rationalization. I was just tired. It's not a big deal. I'll fix it tomorrow. And individually, these thoughts seem harmless. But together, they protect the pattern. They make it invisible again. So part of breaking the cycle is being brutally clear with yourself. Not in a way that attacks you, but in a way that refuses to lie. Instead of saying, I didn't have time, you say, I avoided it. Instead of, it just happened, you say, I chose what felt familiar. That level of honesty is uncomfortable. But it gives you power, because you can't change what you refuse to see. Now there's another layer that matters just as much. Your environment. You don't make decisions in isolation. Your surroundings constantly influence what feels normal. The people you're around, the conversations you have, the things you consume. All of that reinforces certain patterns. If you're surrounded by people who normalize avoidance, distraction, and inconsistency, those behaviors feel acceptable, even expected. But when you change your environment even slightly, something shifts. You start seeing different behaviors, different standards, different ways of responding. And that expands what feels possible. You don't need to completely change your life overnight, but you need to be aware of what your current environment is reinforcing. Because if everything around you supports the old pattern, breaking it becomes much harder. Now let's go deeper into identity, because this is where real transformation happens. As long as you see yourself as someone who always does this, you will keep doing it. Not because it's true, but because it's familiar. So instead of trying to force a new identity, you start proving it to yourself in small ways, not through words, through actions. You don't say, I'm disciplined. You show it in one small decision. You don't say, I've changed. You demonstrate it in one different response. And over time, those small proofs start building something new, a different self-image. One that is based on evidence, not intention. And that's powerful. Because when your identity shifts, your decisions start aligning with it naturally. Not perfectly, but more consistently. Now here's something important. You will slip. You will have moments where you fall back into old patterns. That's not failure, that's part of the process. The difference is what happens after. Before, you would fall back and stay there, and now you notice it faster, you recover quicker. You don't turn one mistake into a full return to the old cycle. That's progress, not perfection. And over time, those quicker recoveries matter more than long streaks of being perfect, because they show that the pattern is losing control. Finally, understand this. Your life is not shaped by one big decision. It's shaped by repeated small ones. The invisible effect works through repetition, and so does change. Every time you pause instead of reacting, you weaken the old path. Every time you choose something different, even if it's uncomfortable, you create a new one. And at first, that new path feels strange, unnatural, even wrong. But that's not because it is wrong. It's because it's new. And your brain is still learning it. So don't trust the feeling of familiarity as a guide, because familiarity is exactly what kept you stuck. Instead, start trusting awareness. Start trusting the moments where you see yourself clearly. Because once you truly see the pattern, you're no longer fully controlled by it. And once you're no longer fully controlled by it, you finally have a choice. And that choice, repeated enough times, changes everything.